Well, hello, everybody, to our For the Love of Creation webinar on the road past COP, Spirit and Change. And I'll give a little introduction to that topic a little bit later, but I just wanted to thank everybody for being here. For those who don't know me, or even if you do, my name is Randy Haluza DeLay, and I work for Kairos as the Ecological Justice Program Coordinator, in which I've been involved with the Climate Action Month, climate justice campaigns, and other ecological justice initiatives, including the upcoming COP15, which is on biodiversity, and to me is really, really important, is equally important as climate change or the climate emergency, uh, which COP27 was about. And they are linked issues, and they all have to do in many ways with our relationships in the community of all creation. As human beings, we're just part of creation. So I want to start with a land acknowledgement. And all of you are coming from different parts of Turtle Island or Canada. And in fact, perhaps from elsewhere around the world. And I know one of our speakers is from outside North America. Uh, so just take a moment to ponder your location and recognize that it has long histories with communities of human beings and other beings that have gone back millennia, millions of years, and have changed over time as well. But we acknowledge that we're on the land and in the land and as part of the land wherever we're located, and that we are called to respect and to honor that land and to honor all of the relationships in the land. So I speak from Toronto in Southern Ontario, although I'm from Alberta. And so I actually posted to Facebook the other day that my home province, and named it as Alberta, and then got called out by some people here in Ontario saying, hey, you moved here. Um, but it shows that we have relations to places, and that's really important. So I acknowledge that here in Toronto, I live on the land covered with by the dish with one spoon, wampum covenant. And that means with one spoon, we share the land itself. And we have a duty. And we are called as people who have come here in many different ways, whether we were the original people who were part of that covenant, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, the Wendat, Mississaugas of the Credit, among others, or whether we're settlers, as I am. And today, many peoples share this land, and we're all called, and we welcome and are thankful for being allowed to be part of the land from the peoples who have taken care of it from time immemorial. So these territories that we live on are subject to many treaty relationships, but that means relationships between people. And we wish, in looking back on past history, that those relationships were done better in the past, but we covenant now to do them better in the future. So knowing the role that our country, our faith communities, our peoples have played and continue to play in things like colonialism, racism, ecological degradation, and so forth, I acknowledge, and I hope that you will also acknowledge, a commitment to a relationship of learning from and solidarity with Indigenous peoples and the rest of the community of creation. Ian, can I turn it over to you to begin with a prayer?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Randy. I'm Ian. I live in what we call the town we call Langley, British Columbia. I live on the unceded territory of the Stalo people of the Stalo River Valley, and hope to honor the my living in this place that has been a place cared for by the Stalo Nation, the Kwantlen, the Katzie. Normally, I would be doing this with this prayer with Sabrina Shifari, but she's not here this week. And Sabrina would say that to open with prayer is to have or take a collective deep breath. In this collective deep breath, we pause and reflect on our sacred ties with the earth. We pause in gratitude for our speakers, for their generosity of spirit, and for the time that they'll be spending with us. We take a collective deep breath in the topic for today, spirit and change. We need a good deep breath for this one. Change in the face of climate crisis can be daunting and overwhelming. There's so much that needs to change. There's so much that needs to be done. But as a person of this earth, I believe that change is good if it offers hope, if it connects us further with this good land. Change is a salve for the soul that knows that things aren't as they ought to be. So I'll pray as I have for the other. We will pray to the Holy Creator, Giver of life. We want to know the names of all that all things bear and the sacred depth of their being. Names given to all these good things by our Creator, and not the names given by the forces of conquest and domination, of entitlement and ownership, of consumption and destruction. We seek spirit, and we seek justice. And more than ever, we know that we are part of this same big global ecosystem. We are all beautifully connected. May we honor this sacred reality in all that we are and all that we do. We seek spirit and we seek solidarity. And as creation groans in the depth of our souls, we know that things must change. We seek spirit and we seek change. In all we say and do, may we honor all life as sacred, and may our time together be a prayer. Amen.
Thank you, Ian. So as most of you know, the theme of this particular webinar is spirit and change. This was originally to be a webinar in October as part of a three-part series that For the Love of Creation was doing in October on the road towards Cop27, but we changed it. And so it became this one here on the road past Cop27. The other two webinars were named Spirit and Solidarity and Spirit and Justice. And that goes to our understanding as For the Love of Creation, that spirituality, a deeper, an ontological commitment to something beyond just the material world, or that the world is not just a material thing, is a really important part of our relationships, our relations, and I would also argue our theories of change. You know, how does spirit play into change? You know, what are the avenues for really effective and good societal change? And in fact, that is kind of the orientation of this webinar. The IPCC in its reports a couple of years ago said for the first time that there needs to be a relatively profound societal transformation. And at that point, the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, didn't identify what that meant. The IPCC is scientists who study climate change. The vast majority of them are physical scientists. I, like Angel, am a social scientist. So we have our thoughts about how societal transformation both comes about, but also what sorts of things are needed. And that's again, the zeitgeist of this session. So I'm really looking forward to both of our speakers on that. So we have two speakers. One of them, who will speak second, is Michael Poland, and he is the campaign director for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty. And we all know that fossil fuels are the #1 driver of the changing climate that's leading to a climate crisis. And so the idea of a non-proliferation of fossil fuels is something that he will talk about, because that's a fairly profound change in our global society, much less our Canadian society, much less Alberta, where both I and Angel come from. And Angel Alouk is our first speaker, and so I'll introduce her right now. She is an assistant professor at York University in Toronto. She has worked with a number of different research projects, some of which I've actually been a little bit involved with, and that's how I've seen her work, been impressed by her work, and was excited to make contact and have her come and speak with, the 60 of us or so who are here now. So, and Angel has studied gender and resource extraction. She is from the Big Stone Cree First Nation in northern Alberta. She has worked for the Alberta Federation of Labor. A major research project that she was involved with was called the Corporate Mapping Project, which tried to map out the linkages between the resource extraction corporations and the politics of the Western provinces, and by extension, all of Canada. And she has been working more recently with a project called Just Powers, which is about justice, powers, corporate power, and I would also assume people's power, because civil society has its own enthusiasms, its own spirit, its own zeitgeist, its own energies, and that's why you're here, because organizations like For the Love of Creation and Kairos Canada have been involved in trying to mobilize people to say something different. If you had followed Kairos Canada's Climate Action Month in September, you know that our theme was decolonizing climate action. And that means that this session, and especially Angel's presentation, will be incredibly important in that aim. So I'd like to turn it over to you right now. Dr. Alouk, will you take it away?
Oh, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm just going to share my PowerPoint and kind of adjust my screen here so I could see as much as I can. Yeah, so I had the privilege of attending Cop27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, for the first week of COP. And for me, I mostly attended this COP as a researcher. I've attended a couple other COPs before, and I was really there speaking out and presenting and being very active. And I'll explain why this COP was a bit different for me. Those are just a couple images from COP, some of the Indigenous youth that were there, and the Indigenous Pavilion, which really created a space for Indigenous people at COP27. So yeah, that's kind of a funny picture I took when I was doing the Just Powers research. I was making the film Bigabayan, which means it is broken, which features the issues in my traditional extraction and the cumulative impacts of oil and gas, forestry, and all the development around my community of Big Stone Cree Nation. And I was filming with Jamie Bork-Blind, who's a Métis filmmaker, and he told me to point like a Métis Cree woman, so I pointed like that, and we took that while we were out filming. Anyways, I am a sociologist. I study gender, race, class, energy, and the environment. And I'm involved in different kinds of research. So my research is very intersectional. Most of my research projects were introduced. I think, you know, I really got involved in this work because I saw the political and economic power that oil and gas has in Treaty 8 territory, because my traditional territory is located within the Athabasca oil sands region. There's 3 oil sands deposits in Alberta, the Athabasca, the Peace River, and the Fort McMurray. And my community is right there in the middle of the oil sands region. And in my dissertation research, I really focused on how the oil industry created racialized gendered life scripts for people in my community, really kind of determined, you know, the education system and the labor market for Indigenous people, in that young men ended up leaving school early, dropping out, and ended up going into the oil industry, and ended up with more precarious, unskilled work. And then a lot of the people I interviewed resisted that life script and really chose education and other types of employment. And Indigenous women had different options and tended to work in public service and seek out education throughout their lives, even if they became mothers. So I really started looking at how the oil industry gendered and racialized the workforce and created different life scripts for Indigenous men and women. And then with the corporate mapping project, we really saw the political power that the oil industry has over the education system, over the banking system, the relationship between, you know, people who are CEOs and executives, and how they sit on the boards of universities, they sit on the boards of banks, and they work for the Alberta Energy Regulator, and the industry regulates itself. So I really started seeing the power that oil has over our economy and politics in Alberta. Even as I worked for the labor movement under the NDP government, even though, you know, that government introduced climate change leadership policies, it was still very colonial. Indigenous people didn't get as much funding under that policy as energy companies did. You know, our federal government and provincial governments that were involved in, you know, buying pipelines and promoting pipelines, even as they spilled oil into our traditional territories. And we know that they don't create stable full-time employment or long-term jobs. Our governments support, you know, oil industry in that way. And so recently I've started a new research project called Indigenous Climate Leadership and Self-Determined Futures. In that research, I really want to focus in on traditional knowledge holders and elders and youth that are involved in climate action. And by leaders, I don't just mean elected leaders. I mean people out there who are starting organizations and movements in their own community and, you know, participate in actions. So as part of that research, I attended the AFN climate change gathering in September to kind of understand what's happening out there across Canada with Indigenous people. And that's also why I attended Cop27, because I wanted to interview some Indigenous youth climate leaders. And so that's why I that was what I spent most of my time doing at Cop27. And I'm also part of this book project called The End of This World, Climate Justice in So-Called Canada. And for that book, I helped draft the first chapter to talk about how Indigenous settler relations and returning to treaty are really important for a just transition. And also, I wrote a chapter in that book on returning to Indigenous caring economies, and also for, our governments to invest in care economies like healthcare, education, childcare, and all of these public infrastructures when we are considering a just transition, because a lot of just transition discussions focus on very masculinized jobs, and mainly focus on, what are we going to do about resource workers? And even in Alberta, only about 6% of people work directly in oil and gas, even though it's about 30% of the province's GDP. When you look at just transition discussions, they focus on what are we going to do about these male breadwinners, with not much discussion about the public sector or female workers or racialized workers who tend to be in more precarious, informal work. And then in that book, I talked about, if we're going to return to Indigenous economies of care, we need to focus on Indigenous laws. And so in that book, I wrote about Menacheh Dawin, which is a Cree law of respect and only taking from the earth what we need to survive. I talked about Seduska Dawin, which is the law of pulling together and working together in solidarity to come out of this climate crisis. I also talked about the importance of relations, and how we have relations with our human and non-human relations, and that's important for returning to Indigenous care economies, and how our current economy is very capitalist and colonial, and really creates increased violence towards Indigenous people, especially our most vulnerable people like Indigenous women and our Two-Spirit folk. And also how basically our current capitalist colonial economy is one based on death and destruction, and we need to move towards Indigenous economies of care if we are going to sustain our lives as humans on this earth. And so that will be coming out in 2023 in a couple months. And so all of these things, and also valuing the care work that women do, whether it's paid or unpaid work, and how we need to really focus on returning to care economies based on sharing and caring and reciprocity. And it's funny because I actually didn't write about one of the Cree laws I didn't write about in the book was love. Sagitawin, because it's such a sacred law, and really it's central to everything. And I just felt it was too sacred to even write about, but I don't think we can have care economies unless we have a love ethic in how we build our society. So anyways, that is the work that I've been doing, and that is the book that I've been working on the past year or so. So, while doing all this research, and talking about how oil and gas is not healthy and does not bring balance to our communities, creates increased violence towards Indigenous women and folks, I decided to attend Cop25. I didn't just decide. York University was sending a delegation. And I thought, you know what, I've been talking about just transition. I've been talking about, oil and gas and how we need to keep it in the ground, and how capitalism and colonialism are tied together. I applied to be part of the York University delegation as part of the Ringo constituency at COP, which is a research and independent NGOs constituency. And so while at this COP, there's a photo here. As soon as I got the COP, I kind of just jumped into things. I was there and I saw some land defenders I knew from Northern Alberta, and they said, "Oh my goodness, you're here just as a researcher. You should come to the Indigenous Peoples Caucus tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. And you should be doing work with Indigenous people, not just researchers." So then I spent the rest of that COP with the Indigenous Peoples Caucus and attended fewer Ringo constituency caucuses. And while I was there, the Gender Action Plan came out from the UNFCCC. And one of the first things that happened at the Indigenous Peoples Caucus while I was there was that the Indigenous women took over the caucus, and they said, Indigenous women's voices need to be at the forefront. We need to talk about how climate change and resource extraction is affecting women more violently. And the relationship that we have with Mother Earth is also, the relationship we have with women. And there's that connection there with the way we treat the earth is how we treat women. And so I got right in there and I helped draft a high-level statement on gender on behalf of the Indigenous women of the Indigenous Peoples Caucus. That's a picture of us drafting it. Those are some Indigenous women from South America. We had to have translators there. And I was lucky to work with Hoka Job from Panama, and she spoke Spanish and English and Portuguese, and Hokabad, that's her name. Her name is Hokabad, and she's from the Indigenous Memory Society in Panama, which is also a faith-based group. She does really amazing work because they're being impacted by climate change because of the change in the ocean. Anyways, we drafted this statement, and Hokabad read the statement out in English. And it was really my introduction to what you can do at COP. We were given 2 minutes to speak at COP. We wrote a long statement and a short statement, and we tried to turn it into a position paper. And I worked with some amazing women from North America as well, like the Janine Yazzie from the NDN Collective. Some women from Indigenous Climate Action were there. And, one thing happened while I was at that COP. There was an action that was held against the American government while we were there. And so Indigenous women are trying to raise awareness around murdered missing Indigenous women in America. And so some of the Indigenous women I was working with on this high-level statement and policy paper ended up being debadged while I was there. So the night before, we were there at 6 p.m. trying to finish this statement, and we found out some of our sisters were debadged. They couldn't get back in. We couldn't finish our long statement. And as we were sitting there upset that we couldn't finish this work, and we'd stayed there most of the day, the Queen of Spain walked by, and I thought, oh my God, she can come here and show her presence. But Indigenous women got debadged that day, and we couldn't finish our work. And I just thought, I'm in a colonial state. Spain is where colonialism came from for all of my South American sisters. And I just really felt the presence of colonialism at that point. And then, you know, COP being in
Mommy,
Scotland.
daddy.
Okay, I don't think that's true. I'm sorry, it's bedtime here, and it's very, that's my King Solomon. He's exaggerating the difficulty of bedtime right now. Yeah, so I went to COP27. At COP26, I traveled with the Indigenous Climate Action Delegation. And I was part of the Indigenous Peoples Constituency. So at this COP, I really tried to support the ICA folks in any way that they needed. I supported youth in speaking up and having a voice. I think it was one of my strongest contributions. I kind of became like an auntie and really just told our young women to just go out there and speak and not be afraid, because there was some racism and sexism that we experienced that, you know, was difficult, sometimes blatant and sometimes more indirect. And also, while I was at this COP, I screened my film, Bigabayun, It Is Broken, at the Indigenous Pavilion. These are just some photos at the art studio. That's another thing a lot of NGOs and Indigenous organizations do, is they create art while they're at COP and then use it in the marches. And so this was in preparation for the Murdered Missing Indigenous Women march that they had inside the COP venue. So at COP27, we saw the largest Indigenous peoples presence at any climate negotiations. And Indigenous people really worked hard to have an Indigenous pavilion. They raised money. That's a picture of Janine Yazzie from the NDN Collective with all of her, I think, staff. They really worked hard with Indigenous climate action and different Indigenous organizations in raising money to have a pavilion, to have a space for Indigenous people to speak there. In addition, there was the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change discussions. And those started 2 days before COP. We had discussions about, you know, what the focus would be for Indigenous peoples at this COP, which were things like loss and damage, you know, including Indigenous rights and human rights, and also uplifting the voice of youth. And so, yeah, there was that meeting that happened right before the COP meeting. And so because I was at this COP to interview Indigenous climate leaders, I spent a lot of time at the Indigenous Peoples Pavilion, and I also spent a lot of time at the Canadian Pavilion. I spent a lot of time with Indigenous youth, which were very inspiring. I just, you know, when I was 22 and 25, I was not that inspired. Our youth that were there are highly educated, not just in Western knowledge. Like I met youth there with master's degrees and law degrees, but also youth who have gotten knowledge from their elders and from ceremony. So they really come prepared. And Indigenous people all over the world are facing the climate crisis at the forefront and are the most vulnerable to this crisis. And so our youth are really there just speaking out and are very powerful. So I ended up interviewing 7 people while I was there. I recorded some panel discussions also, especially discussions where Indigenous women were speaking, because I feel like Indigenous women are climate leaders and leading these movements. And I also have recorded some sessions with Indigenous youth. There was a session with BIPOC youth at the Canadian Pavilion. And also when I left COP, there was also in week 2, there was a session at the Canadian Pavilion of Two-Spirit queer voices as climate leaders. And I think that was very important and very brave of our youth to do, especially in a country like Egypt. You know, one of my colleagues from the York delegation was messaging us as he was leaving the country saying, I hope I don't get arrested. I hope I make it through security. And so that whole day when I was in Canada waiting for this colleague of mine from the York delegation, it was very nerve-wracking because we know that protests and actions were not as loud or lively as they were in past COPs, as they were in Egypt. Yeah, and then the rest of the time I was just trying to understand the message from youth from around the world. So I'm still analyzing those interviews. Yeah, but one thing I can say is our youth come to COP very articulate. They know the issues, they know what's happening back home. And, you know, I think we just need to follow the youth if we're going to get through this climate crisis. I was also invited to a media conference in Kicking Out Big Polluters from COP, and I was part of a walkout at the Canadian Pavilion against oil executives and banking executives. So I did get in on some actions, but you know, I was mainly there to understand the messages from our youth. I'm just going to check my chat. I don't know if okay. Sorry, I'm just checking my chat because I feel like I'm talking too much right now. So yeah, these are just some pictures. This was the Indigenous Voices from the Front Lines panel at the Canadian Pavilion. It featured, you know, people like Ariel Deranger, Brianne Lavallee, Rebecca Sinclair, and I can't remember her. She's a youth named Sage from Ganawage, and they all spoke. The thing that was really great about having Indigenous panels was that, you know, Indigenous people share knowledge through stories. And that was one thing that I saw on this panel. Sorry, that's a video. I recorded a youth at the International Indigenous Peoples Forum speaking. I was going to share it if I had time, but I think I'm running late on time. There was some actions that took place at COP. And the ones that I captured were the ones that were led by African activists. And, you know, I think this one was led by women from Zambia, and the big polluters one was led by an African delegation. I'm just going to play this video. Again, because of cyclones, because of floods, because of droughts, yet you are refusing to pay us. Okay, sorry, I'm hearing that you can't hear the video, so I will, if at some point later, share it with you. So I think, you know, one of the things that I've learned from attending COPs is how Indigenous people really create a presence at COP. This is a picture from Cop26 at a march I attended. And And then this, I actually really want to share this video, so I'm going to find a different way to share it right now. But, you know, I think Indigenous people are decolonizing climate policy and bringing Indigenous solutions just with their presence. Like while I was there, you know, there was presentations by, you know, highly educated Indigenous people talking about the law and policy and our traditional ecological knowledge, but we also shared music and ceremony. There, you know, we participate in marches and organize our own marches at COP. Indigenous people, you know, there's a group of Indigenous elders and some high-level negotiators that work to negotiate, including Indigenous people in the Paris Agreement. You know, we share our art, and just being at COP together, we share our kin and our love with each other. You know, I wouldn't have been able to attend this COP or have the energy to be there without the support of all of the Indigenous folks that I traveled with. Because it is very difficult being Indigenous in these venues. You know, what we're saying is often in opposition to industry and governments, because in order to assert our sovereignty, nation states need to move out of the way, and oil companies and energy companies. So, you know, it takes a lot out. And I think there's a kinship that happens among Indigenous people at COP. You know, one particularly difficult evening, we had ceremony and smudged out in the grass inside the venue, and, you know, just talked about our day and the things that we accomplished, but also some of the difficulties of being in there. At the last two COPs, there was a water ceremony that happened early in the morning. Unfortunately, this time it happened the morning the day that I left. At this COP on November 15th, there was an Indigenous Women's Day, which I was able to attend at the last COP, you know, in order to highlight No More Stolen Sisters on Stolen Lands. So I think, you know, Indigenous people really work hard to create a presence at COP, and especially at this last one, with having our own pavilion and large delegations. We were able to make our presence known. Sure. So, yeah, and I met amazing Indigenous youth climate leaders that, you know, I met youth from Ganawage that talk about living right next to this St. Lawrence Seaway, and how the bridge gets in the way, and how, you know, they're surrounded by industry and pollution, and how their hunting grounds are infringed on. I met some youth from Treaty 8, some youth actually from my traditional territory, and, you know, it was refreshing to hear a youth's perspective on how to deal with the oil and gas industry, and just the energy that they have and the dedication that they have, and very active in the discussions. The Indigenous youth were very active in the discussions that shaped our negotiations as well. And the youth were just like constantly taking part in actions and panels, sharing their knowledge, caring for each other, you know, and also having relationships with the elders that were there. There's some great elders that attend COP, that have been attending COP for the past 27 years, that are building relationships with our youth. So there's that intergenerational sharing of knowledge that also happens at COP, which I find is interesting. And being that just transition is one of my research topics that I study a lot, I did attend some sessions with it at the International Labor Organization's pavilion. I attended some of their side events. This is a woman from Canadian union, speaking about how, some plants around Toronto, the car industry is changing and moving towards electric, and how they're transitioning. I attended a talk where they were, talking about how the just transition is affecting truck drivers, and also, how resource workers who are unionized are having these discussions about transition as unions with employers and with governments. I think there's some government officials there from Spain and Brazil that were speaking about their just transition with resource workers and energy workers. But there's a whole discussion missing in these forums on non-unionized workers. And the only time I heard any discussion about Indigenous folks or racialized minorities is when some people from the labor movement in South Africa and Nigeria spoke, and they talked about how, still a lot of racialized workers and workers in the global South tend to be informal workers and have less labor rights. So, I wasn't that inspired by the just transition discussions. I feel like unions were just patting themselves on their backs and saying, yay, we've had these discussions, we're talking to government and industry. But I think that unions need to do more for wider society and have solidarity with, Indigenous folks and racialized folks and poor folks in order for there to be a real just transition. It was all too shiny and congratulatory on the part of unions and labor organizations. So I was not impressed by those discussions. They've been discussions I've sat in on before. So I just wanted to end here, at the panel discussions with some of the Indigenous women, climate leaders, and youth, some of them ended talking about love as, our love of each other as kin, our love of Mother Earth. That's decolonizing climate change, our carrying on of our language and our traditions on the land. That is what's going to, solve this crisis. And so I just wanted to share some quotes from Bell Hooks, where she talks about love as a practice of freedom and as revolutionary. She says the absence of a sustained focus on love in progressive circles arises from a collective failure to acknowledge the needs of the spirit and an overdetermined emphasis on material concerns. Without love, our efforts to liberate ourselves and our world community from oppression and exploitation are doomed. As long as we refuse to address fully the place of love in struggles for liberation, we will not be able to create a culture of conversation, of conversion, where there's a mass turning away from an ethic of domination. She also talks about a love ethic, and embracing a love ethic means that we utilize all the dimensions of love, care, commitment, trust, responsibility, respect, and knowledge in our everyday lives. And we can successfully do this only by cultivating awareness. Being aware enables us to critically examine our actions to see what is needed so that we can give care, be responsible, show respect, and indicate a willingness to learn. Understanding knowledge as an essential element of love is vital because we are daily bombarded with messages that tell us love is about mystery, about that which cannot be known. So I really think that, one thing I learned from all of my Indigenous kin at COP is that love can be revolutionary, and it can be a practice of freedom. And just being there as Indigenous people, practicing our languages and our ceremony, I got to be there with my friend Jamie Bork-Blyen, and I would go around speaking Cree to him. My parents know some of these activists that have stayed at our house, and they felt comfortable with me being there, knowing that my kin were there with me at COP. My family, my husband, my children knew I was with Indigenous kin, so I felt safe, even though it didn't always feel safe to be so far from family. Yeah, so I'm going to stop there. I'm so sorry I spoke so long. Okay. So I will stop there.
Well, I think you had many good things to say, and I think it's impressive the work that Indigenous peoples are doing. As you said, there's a much stronger presence there now than there has been in the past. I want to turn it over to our second speaker, and then we'll do questions and answers for both speakers at the end of each of the two presentations. So I want you to be thinking about that and think about what you think needs to change, how societal transformation both needs to be really transformative, but also what how you think it might take place. And you can ask that of the speakers as well. So Michael Poland is the campaign director for the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is a global campaign building a momentum behind the proposal for a new international framework to manage a fast and fair transition away from coal, oil, and gas. He's worked as a climate justice campaigner and organizer for the past 13 years with 350.org, the online progressive engagement network, Oxfam, Get Up, and the Climate Council. And he's currently based in Melbourne, Australia, which is either midnight or I think it's actually noon there now. So thanks, Michael. And feel free to start your video, unmute yourself, share slides if you need to or want to, and take it away.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Nice to meet you. My name's Michael. I'm based on Wurundjeri lands in Australia, near Melbourne. It's a pleasure to be with you. I'm quite jet lagged, so it's midday, but my body clock still thinks I'm in Egypt, I think. So I've only just gotten back from Cop27 as well. I do have some slides. I think, Randy, you might have to enable, there we go. Fantastic. So yeah, I'm here to talk a bit about a proposal for a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, which some folks might have heard about. It's gained a lot of momentum in the last couple of years. So I'll just give a bit of a walkthrough of why the proposal is needed, what it is, and then also a bit of information around the global campaign that's building behind it. And then we can jump into some questions. So have a think about any questions you have. So I think everyone here would be aware that climate change is a very significant threat. It's now rated as the greatest threat facing the world, and lack of action to address climate change specifically, an even greater threat now than weapons of mass destruction. The primary cause of that threat is fossil fuels. The production of coal, oil, and gas are responsible for 86% of carbon emissions in the atmosphere. But despite that, governments are still expanding the problem. So this is from the UN Environment Programme's Production Gap Report, which found that governments are planning more than double the fossil fuel production than would be consistent with 1.5. So to meet our global climate targets, we would need to be winding down fossil fuels, but we're still expanding the issue. And Canada and Australia are particularly responsible for some of those expansion plans. But new fossil fuel projects alone aren't the only problem. Even if we stopped any new fossil fuel projects from today onwards, and even if all coal was phased out overnight, just existing oil and gas targets would blow the 1.5 degree carbon budget. So there's a real need not to just stop new projects, but to really find a way to wind down existing production globally. We hear a lot about really good news on the expansion of clean energy, and renewables have become a lot cheaper and are being expanded. But you look at this graph here and it shows that most of the expansion over the last decade has just been additional energy. It's not a transition, it's just being added on top. So as well as talking about solutions, there's a real need to talk about winding down fossil fuels and making sure that we're shifting to renewable energy, not just adding it on top. And currently there's no global agreement. I'll just skip ahead. There's no global agreement to managing this. The Paris Agreement doesn't mention fossil fuels once. The words coal, oil, and gas just aren't mentioned there. And then we saw at Cop26 in Glasgow, and then last week in Sharm el-Sheikh, a deadlock on it being impossible to get that process to mention even the words oil and gas, even just to mention them, let alone to manage a binding global plan to phase them out. So our current climate mechanisms aren't addressing this problem, but it's been very widely agreed that it needs to be addressed. This is the UN Secretary General. The most recent International Energy Agency report has shown no new fossil fuels are compatible with net zero. It's come out of the IPCC. A huge range of different academic and official sources have agreed to it, but we haven't yet found a way for governments to find a framework for that at a global level. So in response to this, there's been growing calls for a treaty explicitly on managing fossil fuel production. The idea first came out of the Suva Declaration, which was issued around the Pacific Island Development Forum in 2015. And since then, it's gained momentum in academic circles and now as a global campaign, not just to manage a fast transition that helps avoid the worst impacts of the climate crisis, but also to make sure that transition is fair and equitable. So managing a global energy transition is quite complex. There are some countries that can afford to do it relatively easily. Canada, the US, the UK, Australia, many European states, they have a relatively straightforward transition because fossil fuels aren't the primary source of their government revenue. And they also have the economic capacity to fund a transition themselves. Some other states are in much more difficult scenarios. So you have a country like Timor-Leste or the Congo, and they have a very difficult transition. Fossil fuels are funding their governments, so they are things keeping open schools and hospitals, and they don't have the economic capacity to transition. And so you have societies that are dependent on fossil fuels and can't shift. And so we need a global framework and mechanism to manage this equitably, both so that countries with capacity transition first and fastest. Canada, for example, should not be opening new oil projects. They should be winding down their fossil fuel production. They have the capacity to do that. And by doing so, they leave more carbon budget for a country like Timor-Leste to transition more slowly. But there's also a discussion over the need for wealthy countries to support countries in the global south who now have to transition much faster and don't have access to the benefits that a country like Australia has had from decades and decades of fossil fuel extraction. So based on all of that logic, the proposal of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty has gained a lot of momentum. It's based on 3 pillars, which draw lessons from the nuclear non-proliferation treaty. So non-proliferation, no new fossil fuel projects, disarmament or a fair phase out, so equitably winding down existing production in line with 1.5, with those with the capacity to do so move fastest, and a just transition, so a framework to make sure that countries and communities and workers aren't left behind in that transition. The proposal also draws a lot of lessons from other successful treaties. So also the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which is a more recent nuclear ban treaty. It had a smaller group of states who first led it, and that's really a strategy we're looking at. And it also had a lot of civil society movements building pressure. That was also a feature of the Landmines Treaty. The Montreal Protocol on the ozone was a small group of countries initially. And the Chemical Weapons Convention had a real focus on shifting narratives around chemical weapons. So based on that, there's now a growing campaign around a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. It aims to actually provide the missing framework and mechanism to manage a global just transition. By doing so, it's also aiming to shift narrative on fossil fuels by associating them with weapons of mass destruction, to help grow the global movement for a global energy transition with a ambitious global demand. And then there's also side strategies on engaging cities and a few other projects. I can also share these slides. So I know I'm racing through a lot of things, but I can send these through. So we have a huge global network behind the proposal. There's 1,800 organizations have endorsed it. We have a whole governance structure with youth activists globally. We have a few key partners of Indigenous peoples and nations. We work closely with COICA, the coordinator of Indigenous nations in the Amazon, as well as Indigenous Environment Network and Indigenous Climate Action. We have big projects with faith communities, with the World Health Organization, with unions. It's getting quite big, and building a lot of momentum with officials globally. It's backed by a steering committee of leaders from all around the world. And this is just a few of them. There's about 30 people, full list on the website, and has a lot of different strategies. So we have regional hubs in different places around the world. We have a stream of work trying to get cities to endorse, similar to how nuclear-free cities built momentum for a nuclear treaty. We're getting cities to come out taking a stance on fossil fuels. There's a whole research agenda. We have a team of people building support with nation states and doing diplomatic engagement. And we have a big communications effort as well. As I said, a big global network of groups all around the world. Kairos was one of the first groups actually to endorse, I think back in 2020. And it's really grown since then. I think I can skip through a few of these. Yeah, a lot of different partners around the world, as I mentioned. It's also been backed by 3,000 scientists. We have a network of MPs and parliamentarians and senators, 500 or so, and we're looking to build that a lot over the coming year. And yeah, a lot of news coverage around the idea. And these are just some of the big moments in the past year. So the Dalai Lama and 100 Nobel laureates backed it, including Jose Ramos Horta, who's now the president of Timor-Leste. The Vatican supported the proposal. The World Health Organization, particularly given the impacts fossil fuels have on health. It was endorsed by the European Parliament about a month ago, just before Cop27. And then Vanuatu became the first nation state to back it in September at the UN General Assembly, and they were joined during COP27 by Tuvalu. And so they, as two states, are now aiming to have other countries join them in supporting the idea and securing a negotiating mandate. And yeah, as I mentioned, a lot of cities, including Vancouver, Toronto, Sydney, Kolkata, many cities all around the world. We have a big partnership with Fridays for Future. Yeah, it just goes on and on. It's quite big. The parliamentarians' work, I think, is quite exciting, and we hope to have people approach their MPs and encourage them to sign on to this project. which was initiated by these legislators all around the world. And yeah, in the past year, we've really had a focus on trying to get more UN forums to recognize the need to address fossil fuels and to begin to talk about the need for a treaty. So Stockholm Plus 50 was in the middle of the year, and it was the first UN conference to recommend a phase out of all fossil fuels. There was then a push for Cop27 to do that. And while that wasn't agreed to in the final text, we did have 85 countries support that statement, which was quite significant. And now we hope to work with many of them on building support for a fossil fuel treaty. Yeah, we've got a huge amount of briefings and resources and research papers on the website that are quite helpful. And we also have a campaign hub with lots of materials on how you can approach your parliamentarians or your cities and get them interested in the campaign. That's it. I ran through a lot of information there, but ways people can get involved is to endorse the idea, join Kairos and these 1,800 other organizations in endorsing the proposal, and promote it in your networks. There's videos and social media assets. Calling on cities to endorse the proposal or MPs to sign up as parliamentarians is really helpful. And then if you live in regions where a government might be interested, we can also help approach ministers or governments. And then, yeah, there's open letters from faith leaders, health leaders, youth leaders that are all live at the moment as well. So that's a bit of a rundown on the Fossil Fuel Treaty campaign. It's big and ambitious, but it's getting a lot of momentum. So we're hoping that more countries will join and we might start to get towards a negotiating mandate for a just transition treaty. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Michael. So I want to say that I've been introducing myself to Michael with my shortened form of my name. So I'm going to go by Randolph for the rest of today instead of by Randy, which doesn't mean good things in Australia. Does anybody have any questions for either of our two speakers or other thoughts related to change, spirit and change, and societal transformation, as the IPCC and others have called for? I haven't seen any questions in the chat, but feel free to pop your hand up and I'll try to see if I can see it, or Shannon will help me. So I had a question for Michael. And Jill talked about Indigenous peoples and how important they are. How would you say they're important in the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty initiative? What role do they have?
So both, I mentioned Koika, the coordinator of the Amazonian nations, and then also Indigenous Environment Networks. Both those groups are on our steering committee and have been from the very start. There's discussions with them in setting up a global gathering of Indigenous peoples to discuss the role Indigenous peoples have historically played in keeping fossil fuels in the ground, and also the role that they can play in building international frameworks to do that at a global level as well. So that's something we're looking at for next year. One thing we've also discussed is that there never has been an international treaty that has allowed Indigenous nations to be some of the nations at the negotiating table. And so looking at if there's legal structures and frameworks to not just have formal UN states involved, but also Indigenous nations in the actual development of the treaty. I think one important thing that I didn't mention is that there isn't a treaty. We haven't written the text of it. That was advised by people who've successfully secured disarmament treaties, that governments really need to be involved in the actual drafting of the text. But we are looking at a project over the next few months of developing more detailed principles, and I guess a structure of what the treaty would cover in more detail. I mentioned those 3 pillars, but go into more detail. And a number of those Indigenous partners will be very involved in that principles project, and they're looking at running consultations with a broader network of Indigenous peoples organisations and nations globally. So yeah, we really see that stream of work as absolutely critical, both to the legitimacy of the project, but also because of Indigenous frontline resistance has been probably the most effective tool and strategy to keeping fossil fuels in the ground, and that has no sign of changing. And so we really see Indigenous communities as helping lead this project. And as I mentioned, it's very much come out of Indigenous communities in the Pacific as well. It's their idea, and they've become the first nation states to support it as well. So yeah, a few different ways.
Jill, do you want to pitch in on this topic?
I'm not sure if there's much more I can say after Michael's comments. It's clear that Indigenous people are part of these discussions. I think one thing that hi, sorry, my son, it's bedtime, but he's not going to bed. I think, you know, I think if there is a international meeting, that Indigenous people will be there. But I think one of the issues is, you know, a lot of Indigenous folks that are climate leaders, they're not like elected leaders like our traditional knowledge keepers, whether they're youth or elders. They come as members of either Indigenous environmental organizations, or they come with Canadian environmental organizations to COP and to some of these international discussions, and they're basically like self-funded, or they're funded by small NGOs. So I think if there is some sort of international gathering, I think, you know, there should be room for funding Indigenous people to attend, and also maybe even allowing some online participation.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And Jill, from your research, what would you say the impact of the resource extraction sector is on Canadian politics?
I think that the oil industry is just like so powerful in Canada. I think that was very clear in all of the studies and case studies that we did with the corporate mapping project, which was a 7-year project, which, you know, we got $2.5 million and then matched those funds. It was basically like a very expensive 7-year research project to prove that basically oil companies and banks and governments in Canada are all working together, and there's no real slowing down of the oil industry. You know, even during the pandemic, we thought maybe there would be less production, or, you know, even when the price of oil drops, they're still drilling and making profits. And I think one of the biggest lies that we hear is that oil and gas provides good jobs and is good for our economy. But that is based on old understandings of of economies. You know, I don't think we should be measuring our economic prosperity based on increase in profits and on growth of economies. I think we need to reevaluate how we understand economies. Are children getting access to proper education? Are our most vulnerable getting access to healthcare? Do we have proper elder care and child care? Like that's how we should measure our economies. Do people have food security? Can people afford food and grow food? Is the land, you know, an ecosystem taken care of in a way that we can grow our traditional indigenous foods? So I think we need to reimagine our understanding of economies and move away from Western understandings of profits and growth. Because that's what our Canadian nation state bases their understandings of economies on. And it's, you know, we saw through the pandemic, like in Canada, grocery companies making record profits. Jagmeet Singh called it greedflation. Like people can't afford food right now or housing. And it's such a uncaring, inequitable system. And that's the system that this profit-based oil economy is based on. And it's unfair and it's uncaring. And, you know, I think we need to move away from that.
There's a bit of a chat discussion going on about the funding of fossil fuels, but also the role that fossil fuels have in our society. And I think, Angela, you've talked to that a little bit about wanting to base how we value things on a different value system than just, you know, economics and economic efficiency. You know, for example, earlier today I was reading an item on how we've changed from a view of economics as leading towards equality and a view of economics as based on efficiency only. But many people have talked about the fact that fossil fuels have been really important in generating the really high quality of standard of living in countries like Canada, and maybe countries around the world should have access to that high energy return on investment from fossil fuels. Or maybe we should work on non-fossil fuel energy generation like nuclear power. Michael, what would you have to say about that? About any of those comments?
Yeah, I mean, one of the main issues that we're seeing is that countries are still expanding their fossil fuel production. I mean, we were just speaking about Canada. Canada plans currently by 2040 to expand gas production by 18% and oil production by 17%. Australia is still expanding its coal production. And yet these countries think they can get away with saying that they're climate champions and really leading on this work. So we're very focused on finding a way to end that extraction and end that expansion. There's, as far as transition pathways, it would be good. I would recommend people look at our fossil fuel exit strategy report. I can put a link in the, which really maps transition pathways, both at a global level, but also region by region. It found that the world has more than enough renewable energy capacity to smoothly transition from our current energy system to a 100% renewable energy system, that we don't need any expansion of fossil fuels to manage that. We don't need any new gas. Gas is not a transition fuel. It's not required to manage that transition. We can move directly to renewable energy. I think debates on nuclear are very country by country. In Australia, it's illegal, and it would probably take decades to change that, to shift public opinion on it, and then to expand and to produce nuclear energy, by which point it wouldn't be economically competitive. So it's just really out of the question in a lot of places. And I think there's pretty legitimate concerns from a lot of movements on peace and security and environmental impacts outside just emissions. But in some parts of the world, it is being used to speed up transition away from fossil fuels. So I think it really depends on where you are. I generally try to avoid getting too into those debates. I think there's a pretty simple pathway in most places out of fossil fuels to clean energy. And that often we see some of these debates come up to try delay or muddy the waters and slow down that transition. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd have to agree. You know, when I was in Alberta under the NDP government, and we had a climate leadership policy, I attended a lot of discussions with economists from banks, from unions, academic economists, and energy engineers. And there's so much innovation. And you know, at one point I remember there was this map of Alberta showing how we can use different types of renewable energy depending on what part of the province we were in. Whether it was like geothermal or solar, or wind, you know, that there were so many, like, depending on where you were in the province, there was a renewable energy source that could be tapped into. And just hearing the excitement of even some of these energy engineers and energy economists at that time of like, we can do this. There's solutions that are local that we can use. I think, you know, those options are available. I think we're just stuck doing things the old way. Thinking, you know, the thing with oil is that people make a lot of money really fast. And I don't think that's a good way to live. I don't think it's good for your spirit or for humanity. I don't think that level of accumulating wealth is right. Yeah, anyways. So I just wanted to throw my 2 cents in there.
Well, that's worth way more than 2 cents, I think. I think we'll go with one last question. And somebody has asked, and I hear this a lot, how important is it to keep going to these COPs? There's Cop27 that has just ended. Both of you have come back from it. There's Cop15, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity, which will be happening in Montreal in December. And again, another congregation of the parties. How important is it to keep going to these COPs? And for example, Cop27 gave a tacit blessing to natural gas as a transition fuel. It didn't produce a strong emissions cap. It announced no phase down of fossil fuels. So should we keep going? Should we keep sending activists and delegates to COPs?
I think so. I think there's a couple reasons. The fossil fuel industry sent 636 lobbyists to this COP, and yes, they had an influence. But I think that if civil society and a global network of climate justice activists weren't there, we would have seen an even worse result. There still was a mention of the need to wind down fossil fuel subsidies. There was a mention of coal, a wind down of coal. There was a recognition of a new work stream on just transition, which would be a formal work stream in the UN. And most importantly, I think there was progress on loss and damage, which is a demand that has been unrecognized for 30 years. And a lot of our colleagues in areas that are experiencing loss and damage already from climate change very much welcomed that. So I think we do have a real impact on these spaces. And if we weren't there, they would go even more poorly. But I think I've said this in my presentation, these spaces alone aren't a silver bullet. They're not, COPs are not fit for purpose for managing a global transition away from fossil fuels. And so we do need to push for the transition all year round. We need to push for action on a local level, on a national level. And then on the international level, we think we need to complement this process with a new treaty explicitly on fossil fuels. And the defining feature that would be different would be that it would be it would not be a consensus model with all countries. So you wouldn't have major fossil fuel producers able to block action like they did last week. So yeah, I think it's important for people to be there and that we can have a lot of influence on it, even though it's very much not on track and it's very much not perfect.
Yeah, I would agree with everything you said, and I'm glad you spoke first because, you know, my second day at COP, a very important, I would call her Indigenous intellectual activist, not an academic, you know, asked me that question, like, should we keep coming back to COP? Why are we here away from our families? You know, especially bringing our youth and wasting their energy here. Our youth could be in our communities doing so much better work on the ground. But, you know, after being among people in civil society, and especially, you know, there's different COPs that happen at COP. There's the nation states that speak, you know, sometimes we see them give little side event discussions or what have you. But there's also the COP that happens among civil society. Like, I got to attend different discussions with union leaders. I got to, you know, meet some of my heroes in the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. The Indigenous Pavilion is right next to the World Health Organization's pavilion, and health is also one of my research interests in climate change. So I got to, for myself, have these discussions with people like from environmental defense or different organizations. And I think those discussions are important that happen, that might not happen in any other venue, you know, especially among our climate leaders, whether they work for NGOs or Indigenous organizations or nation states. Like our youth, our Indigenous youth got to meet with the Minister of Environment. And so I don't know any other venue where that might happen, where there's a group of Indigenous youth like that to speak to leaders in our nation state. So I think it's important that we continue attending and having a greater presence at these discussions. I have a lot of faith in, you know, Indigenous peoples and civil society. Yeah, so I guess I'd rather have hope than dread at this point.
Okay. Well, thank you to both of you, and thank you to everybody else who's listening and who's participating. There's a really extensive discussion going on in the chat, so I want to remind you all to click the 3 little buttons down in the chat so you can save the chat. And there's lots of links there, including one that Catherine Sisk put out to a report from the Yellowhead Institute, which I'm familiar with and is really good on red washing. We hear a lot about greenwashing. I'll add that I went to Cop22 as a delegate and found it both important and frustrating. And then I think the real richness in my mind, and I was a sociologist also, is the power and the importance of civil society, that we cannot change the world by acting alone, but we can make a difference by acting collectively. You know, 1 + 1 = 3, in my perspective, when we work together. So I want to wrap us up right now and say thank you to everybody for participating. We've got a number of things that Kairos has been trying to do and For Love of Creation has been trying to do. And those 2 organizations partnered together to send a delegation to Cop27 that included a number of our partners from the Global South, as well as a couple of youth and a couple of Indigenous delegates from Turtle Island. And so you should go to the kairoscanada.org website and look at the blogs there and read about their experiences at Cop27, and then go all the way back through previous blogs as well. One of the other things that we're trying to do is to advocate to the Canadian government. And in particular, Kairos has had a campaign on 2 bills related to global climate justice. One is the bill on environmental racism, which has gone to third reading already. So it's close to becoming passed, we hope, for the third time. Third time's a charm, perhaps. And that would be great. This is a bill to address environmental racism and to create a national strategy on environmental justice. The other two bills are on corporate accountability, especially in the resource extraction sector, because Canada is home to around 2/3 of the world's mining companies. And those companies are not required to act with the same kind of human rights and due diligence on environmental degradation that they are required to in Canada, which is really a moral outrage from my perspective. So I put the link in the chat, and please go there. Use the tools that we have for writing letters to your members of parliament and the various ministers of government. I want to turn it over briefly to Shannon to add a couple more things.
Just two things here. Randolph mentioned the delegation that For the Love of Creation and Kairos together sponsored, and we will have an opportunity to hear from those delegates next week on December 1st. Much like when we heard from them before they went and heard their hopes and their the possibilities, we will be doing this in the time zone that suits all of the global delegates around the world. So that means it starts at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And so we hope that you will all come and join us there. If you can't make it or it's not a good time for you, it will be recorded and you'll have an opportunity to hear it later. It will be in 3 languages, so there'll be full interpretation in English, French, and Spanish. If one of my colleagues can drop that registration in the chat, if not, I'll get it momentarily. But I also wanted to tell you that throughout this time with the delegation in Egypt, we had gathered together a group that had we called them the Animators Circle. And so there was a group of about 20 folks who were particularly following the delegation and who committed to lifting those voices, whether in social media, in newsletter articles, blogs, whatever they had access to. And I just wanted to share with you and let you know that that work has been going on and will continue in the months going forward. And you are invited into that work in whatever way that you can to share and spread the voices that we are trying to uplift together as part of For the Love of Creation. Thanks, and back to you, Randolph.
Okay, so I just want to say thank you to both of our presenters, and in the true spirit of everybody being on mute, give them applause. Or you can just do this, which we all also know what it means, or you can find the reaction button. I never can find the reaction button quick enough, so doing something like this works for me. And can I just close us in a moment, a word of prayer? And actually, no, before I do that, in the spirit of this being spirit of and change, I have a quote that I like to share, which actually doesn't seem to be on my share screen anymore, so I'm not going to. I'll just read it to you. I think the most important Christian document, at least, on care for the environment, and it's more than a document on care for the environment because it talks about intercultural respect. It talks about inappropriate attitudes that would be about techno-managerialism and things like that, but it's Laudato Si from Pope Francis. And he writes at one point towards the end, in a way that relates to, our spirit and change thing. A strategy for real change calls for rethinking processes in their entirety, for it is not enough to include a few superficial ecological considerations while failing to question the logic which underlies present day culture. So thank you both to Angel and Michael for helping us to challenge and think about that logic of present day culture and the problems that it has and the need for change in it. So I'll just close us for a moment and say, Creator, thank you for bringing words of wisdom and experience to us. May they fertilize our minds. May you fill us with a spirit of courage and a spirit of love that is revolutionary. Hi, hi, or amen. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Save the chat and go about your merry way.
Thank you.